Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we are going to be looking at cultural landscapes. So let's start with what that is. A cultural landscape is the visible imprint of human activity and culture on the landscape. The modifications to the environment by humans, including the built environment and agricultural systems that reflect aspects of their culture. In other words, the cultural landscape is the fingerprint we leave on the natural environment, including how people have modified the physical landscape to include buildings, signs, fences, and statues, but also agricultural systems and how we use the land. It is the physical record of a given culture. And part of the cultural landscape is the built environment, which is the man-made surroundings that provide the setting for human activity, ranging in scale from personal shelter to neighborhoods to the large-scale civic surroundings. So the built environment is material culture, but the cultural landscape can represent non-material aspects of culture, from cultural beliefs, values, and experiences to economic systems and their technological abilities. Really, it tells us something about the society that created the cultural landscape. But the fingerprints that we leave on the landscape can lay on top of each other. That is known as sequent occupancy or sequential occupation. The definition is the use and modification of a place by successive cultural groups, reflecting differing cultural values, technologies, and social relations that together contribute to a cumulative cultural landscape. So as groups interact, they leave their own fingerprints on the landscape. We might see the language of one culture, while we also see the architectural styles from another. One great example of successive cultural groups leaving their imprint on the landscape is Jerusalem. The Dome of the Rock is one of the most sacred sites for Muslims worldwide because they believe that the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven there. It stands directly above, literally on top of the remnant of the ancient Jewish temple, which was destroyed. The only remaining part of the temple is the Western Wall, which is the most sacred site in the world for Jews. So literally, layers of different cultural groups on top of one another. Tonight we're going to be doing a lot of landscape analysis. And I always describe the analysis of the cultural landscape like this. Imagine that you were blindfolded and dropped off somewhere in the world. How would you know where you were? You would examine all the features of the cultural landscape. You would look at everything you can see, all the imprints we have left on the landscape to try and figure that out. So let's take a look at a few things that you could examine. There are some very recognizable landmarks that demonstrate the importance of culture. Christ the Redeemer is a nearly 100-foot tall statue that stands over Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and obviously illustrates the importance of Christianity for the citizens of Brazil. The Cordillera rice terraces in the Philippines are emblematic of the agricultural system of the region. These terraces have been used for 2,000 years and are very recognizable. And whether we're talking about cornfields in Iowa, tulip fields in the Netherlands, or rice terraces in the Philippines, agricultural activities are all fingerprints we leave on the landscape. Housing styles can reveal a lot about a culture. It can reveal if they're predominantly rural, urban, or suburban, but it can also reveal how cultures change over time. The Mijikenda Kaya Forest on the coastal part of Kenya were once fortified villages, but were largely abandoned in the mid-20th century. So while they were residential for much of their history, they now serve a more spiritual purpose. And often indigenous or local architecture is better suited to and more directly tied to the physical landscape than our popular mass-produced architectural styles that could be adapted to just about any place. Religion can also influence architecture. These are the Persian gardens in Iran. In them, you'll see traditional Islamic influences, such as the elaborate and colorful patterns of shapes. You will not see the human form depicted. Whereas in other religions, human and animal forms are often used. These choices can leave a unique imprint on the landscape. And religious architecture in general, places like mosques, temples, and shrines, literally mark the landscape with the imprint of religious beliefs, conveying information about the values, goals, and identities of the religious groups in the community. Road signs, billboards, placards, as well as graffiti, can reveal the locally dominant language, but can also indicate areas where bilingualism is present, where there might be oppression of linguistic minorities, and other aspects of geography related to language. For example, these road signs in Israel are multilingual, showing Hebrew, Arabic, and English. Styles of architecture can demonstrate different time periods and influences. The Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, is in the postmodern style. And while the building is a museum housing works of art, the architecture itself is a work of art. On the other hand, indigenous architecture can be very distinctive as well, as we see here in New Zealand. This land, which is within a national park, is of important religious and cultural significance to the Maori people of New Zealand. Notice the indigenous architecture and then compare it with the postmodern museum in Spain. Our final example is the Central Plaza in Lima, Peru. The cultural landscape is written across the urban landscape. The Hispanic architecture and Catholic cathedral, the presidential palace, and the large plaza. If you were to make a 360-degree turn, you'd see signage written in Spanish and the high rises of the modern CBD. This plaza is home to commercial and tourist activities, but also has seen political protests. Remember that the cultural landscape and the elements that comprise them are never simply passive backdrops against which life plays out. Instead, the cultural landscape is a dynamic actor in the drama of nationalism, colonialism, religion, among many other factors. But what happens when you take off that blindfold and you see a highway exit with a 7-Eleven gas station and convenience store, a McDonald's and a Starbucks? Where would you be? You might think, I could be anywhere. This highway exit looks like every other highway exit in the United States. Popular culture is characterized by uniformity over large geographic spaces. In fact, popular culture often changes more over time than over space. This leads us to the concept of placelessness, which is the loss of uniqueness of place in the cultural landscape, so that one place looks like the next, also known as a uniform landscape. Placelessness states that certain features of the cultural landscape are generic. If every place looks the same, how can any place be unique? As cultures interact and as popular culture diffuses, we are seeing a standardization of the built environment. There are a few elements that influence this. Certain architectural styles have diffused around the world. We see skyscrapers in many places, and the presence of them on the skyline does not necessarily make a place unique. Many businesses are multinational, and their imprint is often far-reaching. Think McDonald's and Starbucks and Apple. the presence of those logos on the cultural landscape does not define one place in particular. And the final piece that contributes to increased placelessness is the borrowing of distinctive landscape features that in turn blur the distinctiveness. The Las Vegas Strip borrows landscape features from all over the world, from the Eiffel Tower to the pyramids of Egypt to European castles and the Statue of Liberty. The borrowing of these features can make places seem less distinctive, but in turn creates a new form of distinctiveness. If you were to take off that blindfold and you saw the Eiffel Tower, a pyramid, a castle, and the Statue of Liberty, well, there's probably only one place on earth where you can see all of those things at once. And that's all for tonight, folks. I'll see you all back in class.